The fishing industry in Scotland comprises a significant proportion of the United Kingdom fishing industry. A recent inquiry by the Royal Society of Edinburgh found fishing to be of much greater social, economic and cultural importance to Scotland than it is relative to the rest of the UK. Scotland has just 8.4% of the UK population but lands at its ports over 60% of the total catch in the UK. Many of these are ports in relatively remote communities such as Fraserburgh, Kinlochbervie and Lerwick, which are scattered along an extensive coastline and which, for centuries, have looked to fishing as the main source of employment. Restrictions imposed under the Common Fisheries Policy affect all European fishing fleets, but they have proved particularly severe in recent years for the demersal or whitefish sector of the Scottish fishing industry. Fishing areas. The main fishing areas are the North Sea in the seas west of Scotland. Historical development. Fish have been recognized as a major food source from the earliest times. Fishing was important to the earliest settlers in Scotland, around 7000 BC. At this stage, fishing was a subsistence activity, undertaken only to feed the fisher and their immediate community. By the medieval period, salmon and herring were important resources and were exported to continental Europe and the towns of the Hanseatic League in particular. As the industry developed, fisher towns and villages sprang up to supply the growing towns and fishing became more specialized. The many religious houses in Scotland acted as a spur to fisheries, granting exclusive fishing rights and demanding part of the tithes in fish. In the early 19th century, the British government began to subsidize the catches of herring boats larger than 60 tons, plus an additional bounty on all herring sold abroad. This, coupled with the coming of the railways as a means of more rapid transport, gave an opportunity to Scottish fishermen to deliver the catches to markets much more quickly than in the past. Herring is considered a delicacy on the continent and was caught relatively easily off the coast of Scotland, off the east coast during winter and spring, off the north coast of Scotland and Shetland during the summer months, and, in the autumn, off the coast of East Anglia. At this time, there were as many as 30,000 vessels involved in herring fishing the east coast, not to mention others in the Irish Sea. At the peak of the herring boom in 1907, 2,500,000 barrels of fish were cured and exported, the main markets being Germany, Eastern Europe and Russia. The traditional method used for catching herring was the drift net. A long net in the form of a curtain was suspended from corks floating on the surface. The fish were trapped by the gills as they swam against the net. In the sheltered waters around Loch Fyne in Argyll, ring netting for herring developed. The method involved surrounding a shoal of herring with a net and then pulling the ring tight to trap them. Before the 1880s, long lining was the usual method used to catch white fish such as cod, halibut, sei, ling and flatfish which live at the bottom of the sea. It was very labor-intensive but resulted in a high-quality catch. Small line fishing was a family affair with women and children responsible for preparing the equipment. This was a line, up to a mile in length, to which were attached snoods or shorter pieces of line which were baited with fish or shellfish. Great line fishing was similar to small line fishing but was undertaken in deeper waters, further out to sea. The lines could be up to 15 miles in length and would be fitted with 5,000 hooks. The fishermen usually baited the lines on the boat. Because of the work involved in preparing and hauling the lines, new methods of catching whitefish were sought. Trawling was introduced into Scotland from England in the late 19th century, and from the 1920s, seine netting was introduced from Denmark. The First World War interrupted the growth of the industry, with many fishermen enlisting the Royal Naval Reserve. They returned to a declining industry which was further interrupted by the Second World War in 1939. After 1945, much of the effort became concentrated on whitefish, with an additional sector exploiting shellfish. Technical developments have concentrated fishing in the hands of fewer fishermen operating more efficient vessels, and although the annual value of catches continued to rise, the number of people working in the industry fell. The fishing industry in Scotland continued to decline up to the Second World War in terms of the numbers employed in the industry, with commercial fishing virtually grinding to a halt during the war years. The post-war years saw the development of a fleet heavily based on otter trawling, less involved in distant water fishing than the English fishing sector. History of national waters. The concept of freedom of the seas has endured since the 17th century, when the Dutch merchant and politician Hugo Grotius defended the Dutch Republic's trading in the Indian Ocean with the argument of mare liberum, based on the idea that fish stocks were so abundant that there could be no possible benefit obtained by claiming national jurisdiction over large areas of sea. His arguments prevailed, and freedom of the seas became synonymous with the freedom to fish. Countries such as Scotland had claimed exclusive rights to fishing in inshore waters as early as the 15th century, but there was no formal consensus as to how far offshore these areas extended. This ad hoc situation was codified by legislation in the 1930 Hague Convention on International Law. However, only Chile and Peru claimed more than a few miles of territorial waters. This system endured until the 1970s, when it became apparent to nations with large fishery resources that their stocks were being overexploited by non-local fishermen. The 1973 UN Conference on Law of the Sea allowed 200 nautical mile national limits, which were immediately claimed by a number of countries. Gadoid outburst and common fisheries policy. Fisheries are mentioned briefly in the Treaty of Rome. The common market shall extend to agriculture and trade in agricultural products. Agricultural products means the products of the soil, of stock farming and of fisheries, and products of first-stage processing directly related to these products. Fisheries policy was seen, therefore, as an extension of the arrangements for agriculture, and the European Commission interpreted this as requiring a common policy dealing with fisheries. In 1968, the first proposals were put to the Council of Ministers for a common fisheries policy. Implementation of the CFP was delayed by the difficulty in member states reaching agreement on the provisions of the legislation required. An agreement on the two regulations which make up the CFP was eventually reached on the night of the 30th of June 1970, the day that negotiations were due to start for the accession of the UK, Ireland, Denmark and Norway. The 6 existing members were keen that a CFP should be in place before negotiations began, and should therefore become part of the acquis communautaire, which new members would have to accept as settled policy. The late 1960s and early 1970s were characterized by a sudden and unexplained increase in the abundance of a number of gadoid species. The gadoid outburst. In this period, the gadoid species in Scottish waters all produced a series of exceptionally strong year classes which have not been seen repeated in the intervening period. This great abundance, coupled with the price support system that subsidized fishermen when prices fell, contained in the CFP, lead to heavy investment in new boats, equipment and processing capacity in the Scottish whitefish fleet. Britain's negotiating position was complicated by the conflicting interest of the inshore and distant water fishermen. The Scottish fleet had a strong interest in seeing the exclusive 12-mile limit retained, but the UK government was also pressed by the distant water fleet. mainly, but not solely, based on the east coast of England, which wanted to continue fishing off Iceland, Norway and the Faroe Islands. The distant water fishermen were, of course, strongly opposed to any extension of territorial waters of any country, including the UK. The drama of the Cod War with Iceland was still to come, with Britain's attempt to protect the interests of its distant water fleet. Compromise was reached when it was agreed that the applicant countries would retain the 6-mile exclusive limits, and the 12-mile limits subject to existing historical rights for substantial parts of the coastline, preventing continental European vessels fishing in much of the Scottish west coast, including all of the Minch and Irish Sea. These limits have been renewed in legislation on 2 occasions, and although these rights are not a permanent feature of the policy, it is unlikely now that they will ever be extinguished, especially in the light of the need to conserve fish stocks. In January 1977, at the behest of the EEC, the UK and other member states extended their exclusive economic zones to 200 miles at the median line with other countries. This followed the extension of exclusive fisheries limits by Iceland, Norway, the United States and Canada to 200 miles. By this time Norway had decided by referendum not to join the EEC, as had the Faroe Islands, which, as a Danish dependency, had the option to join but did not do so. The 12 to 200 mile zone around Scotland has never, therefore, been fished solely by the Scottish fishing industry, but as a direct consequence of the adoption of the CFP into British law. The outcome of the negotiations was considered by fishermen's representative bodies at the time to be a success. The extension of the 12-mile limit to the whole coastline gave Scotland one of the largest areas of inshore fishing in Europe, and the same limits as before entry to the EEC. Current status. The current status of the fishing industry in Scotland is best considered on a sector-by-sector basis, as each faces different problems and opportunities. Demersal fleet. The Scottish demersal fleet has been facing economically difficult times for several years due to the decline of cod and haddock in the North Sea, which were the mainstay of catches. The fleet has declined from around 800 vessels in 1992 to just over 400 in 2004. This sector catches a diverse range of species and, although cod and haddock are important components, together accounting for 40% of the total landings, in absolute value they represent only a modest turnover of £55 million. Commercial performance of the sector has been dominated by the difficulties over cod, particularly in recent years with the implementation of the European Cod Recovery Plan, but have also been affected by a scarcity of haddock and other demersal species. In recent years much of the demersal industry has been supported by the abundant 1999 year class of haddock. Nephrops fleet. Nephrops norvegicus is a small crustacean better known as Longustina scampi, and, by value, is the single most economically important species caught by the Scottish fishing industry, with landings in 2005 worth £38.5 million, as compared to £22.4 million for haddock, the next most significant species. The Nephrops fleet is varied in its makeup, with larger trawlers fishing in the central North Sea, and smaller vessels trawling in coastal waters, and significant landings coming from vessels fishing with creels and lobsterpots, particularly on the west coast. Nephrops lives on patches of soft mud, in which it excavates burrow systems. The distribution of the species is therefore limited by the extent of these mud patches, which are found in the Firth of Forth, Moray Firth, the North and South Minches, the Clyde Estuary, and the Flarden Ground. In the centre of the North Sea, juveniles and females spend most of the time inside these burrows, with males venturing out more frequently. This difference in behavior, coupled with the inherent problem in measuring the age of crustaceans, means that standard stock assessment techniques cannot be used. Nephrops stocks are assessed by surveying the habitat with TV cameras to count the number of burrows. This is then used to calculate an average population density, and from that to calculate a biomass for a particular area. The total allowable catch is set as a proportion of this biomass. Nephrops stocks in the North Minch have decreased considerably in recent years. The creel fishery in Loch Torridon was first certified as sustainable in 2003 by the Marine Stewardship Council, but the certificate was suspended on the 11th of January 2011. Pelagic sector. The commercial performance of the sector suffered a near-terminal setback during the 1970s, when the herring fisheries in the North Sea in west of Scotland collapsed and had to be closed. As stocks recovered and as it became possible to separate the catching of herring and mackerel, the sector recovered. It became apparent that the domestic market for herring had disappeared, and mackerel became the dominant source of earnings. These trends encouraged a number of enterprising fishermen to set about investing in the modernization of the fleet through the commissioning of new, state-of-the-art vessels. The pelagic fleet is now highly centralized, based in Shetland and northeast Scotland, with a fleet of 27 vessels generating gross earnings of £98 million. The general view is that substantial profit and excellent returns on investment are being achieved by this sector. Recent raids by the Scottish Fisheries Protection Agency on a number of fish processors revealed large-scale misreporting of landings by pelagic vessels. This led to the Scottish component of pelagic quotas being reduced for several years to repay this overexploitation. Fish processing industry. The Scottish fish processing industry accounts for 49% of the turnover of UK fish processing industry. Geographical distribution of the turnover of the Scottish industry is 65% around Aberdeen, 24% in central and southern Scotland, and 11% in the Highlands and Islands. The industry forms an integral part of the fishing-based economy. It accounts for more jobs than the catching industry and aquaculture combined, with the added significance that it provides employment for women in otherwise male-dominated labor markets. Two distinct subsectors make up the processing industry. The primary process is involved in the filleting and freezing of fresh fish for onward distribution to fresh fish retail and catering outlets, and the secondary process is producing chilled, frozen and canned products for the retail and catering trades. The current situation of the processing sector reflects the fortunes of the catching industry. Those involved in processing pelagic fishes and shellfish are expanding their operations, while those engaged in whitefish processing are in difficulty. One of the major problems facing the processing sector is the scarcity of labor in isolated rural communities. Difficulties in attracting local labor reflect the low pay, the seasonal or casual nature of employment, and the poor work environment compared with office or supermarket jobs. The high turnover of labor and high levels of absenteeism experienced in some plants add significantly to labor costs. As a result, firms are now turning increasingly to agency labor and the employment of unskilled immigrant workers. Associated organisations. The fishing industry in Scotland is supported by a number of governmental and non-governmental organisations. Fisheries research in Scotland. Fisheries research in Scotland dates back to the foundation of the Scottish Marine Station, near Oban, and the Gatty Marine Laboratory at St Andrews in 1884. Government involvement in fisheries research began in 1899 with the foundation of the Aberdeen Marine Laboratory, now operating as Fisheries Research Services. FRS is an agency of the Scottish Executive Environment and Rural Affairs Department and provides fish stock assessments, research and policy advice to the Scottish Executive and the Scottish Rural Affairs Minister, Ross Finney. FRS operates two research vessels, the ocean-going FRV Scotia and the smaller inshore vessel FRV Clappy. Non-governmental fisheries research is carried out at a number of Scottish universities and institutes, including deep-sea research at the University of Aberdeen's Ocean Lab at Newborough, marine mammal research at the University of St Andrews, research on the Clyde estuary ecosystem at the Millport Biological Station on the Isle of Cambrai, and fisheries research at the Scottish Association of Marine Science near Oban, and the North Atlantic Fisheries College at Scalloway in Shetland, both part of the University of the Highlands and Islands project. Industry organizations. There are numerous organizations representing different sectors of the industry. However, the most senior is the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, which was formed in 1973 from 8 constituent local fishermen's organizations. The SFF lobbies for the interests of Scottish fishermen at national and international levels in Edinburgh, London and Brussels. The Federation also plays a role in fisheries science by coordinating industry cooperation with scientific partners. The different industrial sectors each have representative organisations, such as the Scottish Whitefish Producers Organisation of the Scottish Seafood Processors Federation. The primary organisation representing the static creel, handline and dive-based sectors is the Scottish Creel Fishermen Federation. http www. Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation, Co. UK. About. HTM. The promotion of fish and fish products along with economic analysis of fisheries is carried out by Sea Fish Industry Authority, a non-departmental public body funded by Levy on Fish Sales, and the Scottish partner organisation, Seafood Scotland. Regulation and enforcement. Whilst the international aspect of European fisheries negotiation, such as the setting of quotas, remain a reserved power, the implementation of fisheries regulations are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and are administered and enforced by Marine Scotland.